Alright, hey. The book I want to do now is by John Cleese of Monty Python fame. This book is called Professor at Large, from a series of lectures he did as a guest lecturer at Cornell University. And I was going to start on page 214 and then actually hop back a little bit. This is an interview he's having with Dean John Smith. I think a lot of people feel that they don't really want to find out what's going on in themselves because we all have good and bad in us. Mother Teresa took up her work when she realized one day that she potentially had a Hitler living within her. She saw that she had the capacity for evil, and she simply chose to do something about it. In my case, for example, I can sometimes tell when I become envious, which is a particularly English trait. And because I recognize the feeling as envy and can say to myself, oh, I'm becoming envious, that gives me control whether I act out of my envy. Do you see what I mean? If I didn't realize I was being envious, I'd think there was something bad about the person that I was envious of. I would start making negative remarks about them. But if you think, oh, I'm feeling envious, well then that's alright. It's just a feeling. It doesn't mean you have to do anything about it. You see, you're just aware of the emotion. And then Dean Smith asks, and the work you did on yourself, did that affect your work? And Cleese responds, yes it did, and Robin Skinner told me, a lot of artistic people are worried that if they go into therapy and examine themselves, they'll lose their creativity. He didn't feel that this was true at all, which helped me. I think now that I'm more creative, but I'm less driven. A lot of people confuse the two. They think that somebody who's very productive is very creative. A lot of driven people are very, very, very productive, but not very creative at all. Also, if you're driven, then you really ought to know what's driving you, you know? You really ought to try and work it out, because otherwise, what are you doing with your life? You're on automatic, not very dignified. Dean Smith, so do you find it any easier to be creative now? Cleese responds, well, I know how to facilitate it now. It's all about creating a space. Space is exactly the right word. That means you have to create boundaries of time and of space. So first, you have to find a place where you can just be quiet. If you've got an office with a secretary, you say to the secretary, I don't want to be interrupted for an hour unless the building is on fire. If you're very junior, you may have to sit in the park. I had a friend at Cambridge who came from a poor working class family, and if he needed to be quiet at his house, he would go and sit in the loo and bolt the door and study in there because it was the only place where he could be alone. So you have to create boundaries to keep people from interrupting you, because interruptions are absolutely fatal to creativity. You have to be able to let your mind free. The moment the outside world comes in and interrupts you, you're not doing that anymore. The second vital thing is you can't be creative unless you can play. And play has got to be separated from everyday life. So you've got to have a time boundary. Trying to be creative starts here and ends there. If you create these boundaries, then you start getting in touch more and more with little notions and images that start floating around. They're only the beginning of proper ideas, but if you explore them gently, they may take shape. It's just like meditating. At the start, your mind's all over the place for a bit, and then, as the Buddhists say, it's like cloudy water. It slowly settles and becomes clearer, and then you can begin to hear the little promptings from your unconscious mind. The interesting thing psychologists have found is that scientists often have their most important ideas when they're in a slightly dreamy state. You see, not when they're feeling all gung-ho. Edison used to sit in a very comfortable leather armchair, and he used to have a little metal tray, and he used to have ball bearings in his hand because he liked to be at that little twilight area between being asleep and awake. So he'd sit there, and if he dozed, his hand would relax and the ball bearings would drop into the metal tray and wake him up, and he would pick them up and start again. Also, the guy who discovered the structure of the carbon ring, August Kekulé, was very tired late one night, and as he was sitting watching the flames in the fireplace, he suddenly got the idea that there were snakes and they were chasing their own tails. That's how he realized that the carbon molecule was a ring. So, when these greatest of all scientists make their discoveries when they're in this very dreamy state, it's completely the opposite of what we're taught about needing to think decisively. The research shows that one of the characteristics of creative people is that they defer decisions much longer than most people do, because they can tolerate that vague feeling of irritation and uncertainty that you get if you haven't resolved something. Some people just can't tolerate that. They've got to resolve an issue, so they take the decision before they actually need to take it. I had this company that made management training films, and the most important thing that I ever learned is, if you have a decision to take, the first question is, when does this decision have to be made? Because that's the real world. It's got to be taken before this or that happens. Well, okay, but don't make the decision before then. So if you're going to be creative, you must tolerate the uncertainty, because two things can happen. First of all, you may get new information which would affect the decision, and I experience that a lot. People want decisions, and I say, I'm not sure yet, I'm not sure yet. And then, during the course of the week, it just becomes obvious. So find out when the decision is to be taken and try to defer it until then, because secondly, it also gives your mind more time to come up with new ideas. Everything I'm saying to you, instinctively, you know it's right. You just think it's unusual because we're not taught this at school, but it feels right. I mean, who at school ever said to you what I'm saying to you now? It should be a basic part of education, and yet nobody teaches it. It's quite crazy. I would also add in that I think part of creativity is it springs from boredom, you know? Sometimes you just have to be bored for a little while and then creative things come along. You know, like when we were kids, before we had the internet era and all this, we would just make up games and be creative and have fun. And I'm going to hop back in the book now. Here's the book, John Cleese, Professor at Large. And I'm going to read another little part of it, which I think is pretty interesting. This is a pretty recent publication, so this is sort of talking about what he did is a live stream that you can buy. It's available on the internet if you look for it. I'm going to put a little mask on for this too. I'm writing a show which in many ways began in Cornell when I met David Dunning. Now, David's a stunning social psychologist who's always been fascinated by how good people were at knowing how good they were at doing things. In other words, self-assessment. He carried out a series of tests with a young student called Kruger, and what they discovered was that the skill set one needs in order to know how good you are at something requires almost exactly the same skill set as it does to be good at that thing in the first place. What a wonderful corollary! It explains so much of the world. If you are absolutely no good at something, you lack exactly the skills and aptitude which you need to know that you're not good at it. It explains a great deal because what happens as you get older, and I promise you I'm not exaggerating, is that you begin to realize, first of all, that almost nobody knows what they're doing or what they're talking about. Very, very few. The great thing about being in Cornell is that there are a few people around who really do know about something, and that's very rare. But I'd had another, similar epiphany. I wrote 2 books with the psychiatrist Robin Skinner, who was a remarkable guy. He was a bomber pilot during the war, you know, and there are not many psychiatrists who were bomber pilots during the war. Hard to imagine Sigmund Freud as a dam buster. One day I asked him, Robin, in your profession, how many people, what percentage of psychiatrists really know what they're doing? He said to me, about 10%. And I was shocked. From then on, whenever I met someone who I just instinctively knew was particularly good at their job, I would say, how many people in your profession really know what they're doing? I never got an estimate higher than 20%. I asked the question many times. Sometimes it was as low as 5, but it was normally 10 to 15%. That was most people's guess. So that means 6 out of 7 people don't really know what they're doing. They learn a process or a procedure, but if that doesn't work, then they're lost. Like me when my computer crashes. You see what I mean? So this is quite a starting point if 6 out of 7 people don't know what they're doing. So I'm writing this show called Why There Is No Hope. And when I start out, I say to the audience, you know, a lot of you have come here to hear me tell you why there is no hope. And you think I mean it humorously, but I don't. And I then point out to them why there is absolutely no hope. There's always been no hope, but it's even worse now. Shall I tell you something interesting? I met a man, you will hardly believe this, in Sarajevo 4 weeks ago who runs one of the biggest, if not the very biggest, marketing companies in America. He told me how he has profiles of somewhere between 185 and 190 million people of what this person likes and doesn't like. We were talking about attention span, and he said, do you know, in 1990, when they measured the average attention span, for young people it was about 15 seconds. Today, a millennial's attention span is now 6 seconds. Now I want you to guess what the attention span of a goldfish is. It's 9 seconds. How can there be any hope in a society where people have less attention span than a goldfish? And when highly trained professionals mostly don't know what they are doing. And I can go on and on and on and on. I had a minor problem with a little bit of surgery in my leg. I had to go and see a specialist at Cromwell Hospital. We started chatting and he said, do you know that during the doctor's strike in New York a few years ago, the death rate went down? So I got on the computer and looked. There are some wonderful statistics there. There was a major analysis done of 5 different doctor strikes by a very respected academic medical journal, and in no case did the death rate go up. In 3 out of 5 of the cases, it went down. When cardiologists leave the hospital and go to conferences, the death rates at the hospital drop. But the good news is when they come back from the conference, the death rate recovers. Then I was with my cardiologist a few weeks ago. When you're my age, you spend most of your time talking to doctors. Really, I said to him, what's this about sugars and fats? He said, John, for 60 years, we cardiologists have got it wrong. It's not fats that cause heart trouble, it's sugars. I said, wrong? For 60 years? He said, yes. I said, but what was wrong with the research? He said, oh, well, it's much easier to get funding for research projects that confirm the current paradigm. Do you see what I mean? If you challenge the current paradigm, you don't get funds for doing that, so nobody challenges it. You see, that's the sort of stuff we're up against. That's why I say there is absolutely no hope. But the great thing about realizing that things are completely hopeless is that you start to relax. Next, your aims become more realistic. You say, I tell you what, instead of changing society, I'll just be nice to a dozen people instead. Because that's achievable. Do you know what I mean? So he did finish that show, Why There Is No Hope, and it is available to stream on the computer if you look it up. I hope you like the mask.